Hi there everyone and welcome to episode 3 of the iProgress podcast. I'm your host Dean and as always I'm joined by Dr. Craig Harper. So today we are going to be looking at the phenomenon which is kind of all over social media at the minute, especially academic Twitter, which is why people are purportedly leaving academia to go over to industry. So for anyone who's been upkeeping with the developments on social media, it seems as though everybody's packing up their lecterns and heading over to this ill-defined concept, which is industry. And from talking to lots of early career academics, it's causing quite a lot of concern about the security of their jobs. It's also causing, leading on from last week's episode in terms of mental well-being in academia, it seems to be quite a stressful time. People are hearing lots of negatives about academia. They're only being kind of presented with these dark and downsides. And I think what we want to do today was have a conversation about that to see, okay, so is grass always green on the other side? Is academia as bad as it's being portrayed in social media? And try to tease apart some of those distinct discussions which are occurring and try to generate our understanding a little bit more. So, Craig, I just brought up the concept of industry being so ill-defined. Why is it that we think that?
Well, it's presented as very much a binary kind of option, isn't it? In terms of we have academia on the one side and we have industry on the other. And those two things are your two options. Now, what we know is that industry is comprised of many different things. It might be that people are going into tech startups, into big businesses, into charities. And what this means is that there are lots of different options for people to explore, but the way that we discuss it is just as academia or essentially not academia. It's something else other than kind of higher education. And that's what we mean by this ill-defined notion of industry. Perfect.
So when we are talking about academia versus industry, because that's almost what it's becoming, one of the main arguments for that is that industry allows the position of an academic to really show the impact and importance of their research and all of the hard work that they've been doing in their universities or in wider academic institutions. And I think that there is a world where academics are perhaps being a little bit frustrated. I know we spoke in last week's podcast about how workloads are increasing, and because of that, there's lots of pastoral care, there's lots of administrative duties, there's obviously all of the kind of lectureship roles that takes place under that umbrella. And perhaps there's a world where academics are they're spending all this time, effort, and in some places money, putting together these research portfolios, publishing them in academic journals, and actually not seeing any real outcomes or reward for that work. And if you look in terms of the kind of current publication process, and that's something we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks' time, it almost feels as though the work's being taken away from us. It's being published. We don't get any monetary returns for that, and the impact just doesn't seem to be there. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, yeah, exactly. And it's this case, isn't it, of how do you get the maximum return, I guess, from the work that you're doing. So if you think about this podcast, for example, we've put out an episode and within a couple of days we've had 3 figures in terms of viewers. So that might not sound like many in terms of podcasting terms, but if you think about the number of readers we might have on a paper, for example, if we put out a peer-reviewed publication in a journal, if we get 3 figures of citations within a year, then we're looking at, that's a very successful paper. So we've had to wait a year for that, a couple of days for podcast readerships and things like that. So I guess in terms of academia, there's it's a much slower process in terms of getting your word out there, in terms of getting your work seen, heard, and used. And I think that's really the key difference between what you're talking about in terms of impact, I guess. It takes a lot of time to develop impact in an academic setting, whereas in industry writ large, then you can do that on a day-to-day basis. You can use your academic knowledge, you can use your research knowledge every single day to make changes to an algorithm or changes to a policy that a charity is enacting. And those things are straight away, they're instantaneous. You don't have to wait for those rewards to come through, and you get these things in a much quicker way as you would within academia.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, and I think it is a great time just to thank all of the kind of new listeners and followers that we've had on social media in terms of getting this at 3 figures in such a short space of time. And I think that it's a real testament to the ideas and the niche that this podcast is able to offer, where we can do those deep dives into academic matters. And I completely agree in that the academic publishing process seems so slow, and perhaps oftentimes, even if you take out the waiting for the kind of peer review process, which we know is vital, that we're not seeing those returns as much as we'd like to. Our investments aren't being reaped in a very efficient terms, and also the people that are seeing and kind of being made aware of our work perhaps aren't the individuals that we really want to see and be made aware of our work. So for example, if I was to do a piece of really hard-hitting and heavy research in my field of study, chances are that the majority of the people in the immediate part who are going to see that are going to be other academics, and that's fine. We do want to generate and proliferate that information, but actually the people that will benefit from my research the most are going to be people in the general population, members of our communities who we're ultimately doing this research to serve. And especially if you have got research funding attached to that research, then actually it's the taxpayers who in the most part are contributing to that funding, and so actually they deserve to have that impact. And I think that's something that perhaps industry, again in quotes because it's such a wide and vague term, it's something that industry is allowed or enabled to offer, that perhaps academia is still a little bit behind the times. And obviously that's not saying that academics aren't kind of doing this public outreach, they're not generating interventions, they're not going into schools and businesses. And I mean, we've got a couple of ideas in the making in terms of business-led interventions, which I'm really excited about. But I think it all goes down to that slow process, and ultimately the lack of funding behind it in order to make real that impact in the general population.
Yeah, and it's that kind of academics then having to work off their own back, adding to their workload, like we spoke about last week. Sure. In terms of creating new tasks for themselves, new additional work for themselves, to try and achieve that impact in a setting where there's not actually that much support for that. I know a lot of academic institutions will talk about developing impact and enabling researchers to get their findings out into the general population or into industry or into wherever it is that's going to make the biggest impact or make the biggest change. But that is a very slow process. And obviously we have different ways that we try to maximize or to speed up some of those things, thinking about the open science initiatives, thinking about blogs, thinking about this podcast. But ultimately, as academics, we also have particular metrics that we need to hit in terms of citations, in terms of numbers of papers. So we need to balance these two competing kind of camps, I guess, in terms of, on the one hand, academia, in terms of what we need to achieve as academics and as researchers, and on the other hand, what's going to be best in terms of getting those research findings out into the community, into spaces where it's going to make the biggest, I don't know, I keep saying impact, but make the biggest change, to have the biggest effect that we're looking for. And that's not easy. It's not a quick thing to do. And we've obviously got things that we're looking at doing in terms of this podcast, in terms of writing, in terms of general kind of outreach stuff, in terms of things online with social media, in terms of the coaching. But it's those two competing interests. I think that's why a lot of academics are being drawn out of academia towards this kind of ubiquitous industry kind of label, because it gives them the opportunity to do that instantaneously. Yeah,
and I do think that the word impact, is the right terminology there. We do want to make our research as impactful and viable as possible, and I think everything you said there just encapsulates my own thoughts in terms of this divide. So if we're moving on to topic 2 today, which is potential reasons that individuals are purporting for leaving academia, we've noted kind of three things that are cropping up, three themes that are cropping up on social media, being mental health, very poignant, something we care a lot about, the expression of an academic, and also the finances, the pay that academics get versus industry. So what I thought was that we could go through each of these, we can note some of the key kind of reasons and rationale about why people believe this, and it's not to say they're wrong in the slightest, but also, as good academics do, challenge some of these thought processes and really kind of put it into context. Because I think sometimes when we do compare black and white, grass being green on the other side, we can take those discussions out of context, and we might still be correct, but I think it's unhealthy to do that. And I think that if we are presenting a fair and balanced argument, then we do need to debate both sides. So if we take the first element, which is mental health, and as we said, this leads very clearly on from last week's podcast, so please do go and check that out if you haven't already. Lots of academics are purporting that they feel burnt out by the vast scope of their duties. Now, we kicked out a whole list, okay? So we've got pastoral care, we've got lectures, preps and delivery, we've got research, planning, funding opportunities, dissemination, mentoring other academics. We've got our committee places that we've got to be on. Some of us have got line managerial duties, and then leading on from what we've just said, we've also got on top of that kind of this emphasis on public outreach and making sure that we're hitting those kind of knowledge performance indicators, which are vital. But when you say it like that, it does purport to be a huge workload. And because of the things we talked about last week in terms of individuals perhaps not being prepped to block out their tasks, to manage themselves, to triage what is vital, what's important, and what can kind of wait and be clumped for another day. People starting to work weekends, starting to work evenings, and leaving from that, we do have a very flexible role to, well, I'm going to be working my 9 to 5 plus evenings plus weekends. Suddenly, that surely presents a very compelling story, wouldn't you think, about why people would want to step out of that job role into something which perhaps is just a 9 to 5?
Yeah, I do. And for me, this is the thing that I see more often than not when people are talking about moving from academia to industry. In terms of, in industry, you have set hours. You have this 9 to 5. You can go in, you can do your work, and then you leave at the end of the day, and that's it. You don't need to be thinking about whether you've got a student that you need to communicate with, or whether you need to prep a lecture for the following day, or if you have a deadline for a grant application that's coming up or something like that. You don't have that same pressure necessarily to be working evenings and weekends. And I remember when I was working in the British NHS, when I was doing kind of research work with the NHS, that was very much the case. You had this kind of flexi time option, so you still had a little bit of flexibility in terms of when you work. So as long as you were getting your kind of 37 hours a week done over those 5 days, Monday to Friday, you could come in and you could start at 7 and leave at 3 if you wanted to. So you had that flexibility within the day. But once you finished work at 3, 4, 5 o'clock, depending on what time you started, that was it for the rest of the day. You didn't have to go home. You weren't checking emails. You weren't thinking on the weekend about what you were going to be doing or whether you had to catch up on something. And I think for me, that kind of work-life balance that people talk about quite often when they talk about moving into industry is the key thing that they are most concerned about.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I have similar I have similar experiences. I mean, mine's actually taken from an NHS situation as well. I was working as a researcher in an Oxford-based hospital. So when I got to work on a Monday, I was kind of given almost a list of tasks that had to be completed by the end of the week to make sure that the research group and the lab was moving towards a goal by a particular deadline. And oftentimes, I would work really hard in that kind of Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, get rid of all of those tasks off my desk, and I would take it to my PI, who's a principal investigator, and they would say, fantastic, that's your quota of the hours done for the week. go and enjoy. You could get a head start on next week's task, but it's not mandatory. And I think that to me is a really great idea of a work-life balance. I think that when you do look at this 9 to 5 in quotes for industry, oftentimes people might be unaware of some of the kind of hidden pressures within that 9 to 5. So for example, many colleagues that I have who have actually moved into industry now, they are still feeling from what I understand, a similar level of fatigue and busyness, but it might just be presented in a different way. You have different goals, you have different outcomes that you have to reach. And as academics, we might be, as you said, looking forward to the next day to prepare a lecture. We might be worrying about a particular student and putting in place best practice to keep them on track and to develop them and push their potential as much as possible. But in an industry world, you might be looking ahead at targets. Okay, so you might know that you have a big deadline coming up in a couple of weeks' time and you're a little bit behind. So going home at night thinking, okay, so actually, how do I help meet that target next day? Okay, so what else can I be doing? What other resources can I be collaborating? Who do I have to reach out to tomorrow? So it's not as if, and this obviously doesn't apply to all jobs, because as we've tried to make a point in this podcast already, industry is a very wide reaching phenomenon. But there are particular jobs where if you do leave at the end of the day, you are still looking forward. So you are almost bringing home work with you, just as you do in academia. And so it might be that we're looking for a more pervasive intervention, far-reaching intervention that allows us to say, okay, so actually what is within your particular remit of your job? Is this necessary? And it might be that regardless of whether you're in industry or regardless of whether you are in academia, that you need to have that mind shift, or you need to be looking at that top-down management structure, which is almost facilitating a culture of where people are taking their work home. Because I think that, as you rightly said, the poor mental health and well-being in academia, at least, and I can guess in industry, is facilitated a lot by people blurring the boundaries between their job and their home life.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things maybe in what you've just said, in terms of people who are in, again, I don't like that we keep using the word industry, but people in those non-academic roles, they still have targets to hit, and ultimately, if they are behind or if they're struggling to meet those targets, then they have exactly the same pressures as we would in academia. In fact, it might even be that they have additional pressures, because let's face it, in academia, if we don't hit a particular target in terms of a number of papers, most universities will appreciate that whether or not something gets through peer review is not something that is within many people's control. We can put out the best paper that we think, and it might actually be worth us having a separate podcast on the peer review process, and we can talk about a couple of examples that we've had where actually maybe we think possibly the best paper that we've written between us still isn't published 4 or 5 years after we wrote it. So we can kind of talk about that process a little bit more. But ultimately, in those situations, there's no huge punishment for that. There's no huge consequence for that, because there will be other papers that we can be working on, other targets that we can be working towards. In industry or in business, if you don't hit a target, then there's potentially a hit on the bottom line. And ultimately, that means that you have managers, you have shareholders that you need to be explaining that to, in terms of thinking through why potentially the company that you're working for isn't as profitable. A lack of hitting those targets or missing those targets becomes much more important and much more consequential in those non-academic roles, I think. I think the second point that you raised was also important, in terms of thinking through the fact that there's that 9 to 5 pressure. People might be going home and thinking about their work, but there might not often be a way of really tapping into the resources that they need over the weekend. So they might be thinking about stuff over the weekend, but not actually being able to do much with that information or do much with that planning. We kind of spoke last week a little bit about how, yes, there might be an expectation in academia that people work over and above that Monday to Friday 9 to 5.
Yeah.
I think ultimately, as academics, if we I don't know, don't want to work on a Wednesday morning or a Thursday afternoon, then we can take those half days back if we want to. And we can work on the weekends where there's still support staff available, there's still library resource available if we need it. Whereas those who are in quote marks for people who aren't watching this, in industry, those resources maybe aren't available for them if they need them on the weekend.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly rounded point there. And also I think it's worth talking about the context in terms of mental health. That, to the best of my knowledge, the data's probably out there though, and we should probably kind of try and follow it up for a future week. We don't fully know a distinct comparison in terms of mental well-being and personal accounts and how individuals feel across different sectors. And I think that's definitely, if it hasn't been done, a very imperative piece of work which will really help facilitate conversation in this area. So a second point of kind of discussion is how academics feel they're able to express themselves. Okay, so in academia, for example, is that the best environment for somebody to be able to fully express their key areas of research, their key interests? Are they able to deliver going back to that word again, deliver that impact that they are wanting to deliver? And also in the kind of background, they have all these competing roles which are impacting on their ability to succeed with that expression. Well, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it'll be different for different people depending on what their goals are. I know for me, for example, a lot of the work that I do is fairly theoretical. I do lots of stuff on how people make decisions, how people form attitudes. Yes, it would be nice to have a look at how that works in practice and what the kind of direct effects are of those different types of attitudes. But the fundamental questions that I'm trying to answer are related to how and why people have particular attitudes or make particular decisions. And it's that kind of moment where maybe a less academic setting is more appropriate for their work.
So yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think that in many ways it boils down to individual personalities, individual research agendas, and also the individual research sector, in which they're housed. And let's put a pin in that, because that's going to bleed very nicely into our third topic of today, which is looking at kind of the impact that has on early career researchers and aspiring academics. But before we move on to that, let's go to that kind of financial world and the elephant in the corner, which is probably, I would argue, one of the driving forces for people leaving academia, and that is the seemingly huge disparity between the pay and how much people are compensated from their work between academia and industry. Now, in academia, I believe, especially in the UK, the majority of us are very lucky. We're in a fortunate position where I would argue that 95% of universities pay increases every year for academics in the most part. You get put up that pay scale, but that really doesn't compare to the huge offset and difference between the academic pay scales themselves and those which we are seeing in industry. Okay, so for example, a few months ago, something came across my desk which I was invited to apply for, which was a kind of like a research governance role, just kind of looking after 3 postdoctoral researchers working on a sector that I've never even heard of before, come across, but you didn't need to have expertise in that sector. It wasn't one of the kind of essential criteria. It was more in terms of just managing a research group, looking for funding opportunities, looking for outreach opportunities, and just in general, developing collaborations and kicking out really high impact research, which is something that we do daily as part of our jobs in academia. The starting salary for that role was 85k. In pounds, okay, which is vastly higher than, I would say, 99% of all academic salaries. And for individuals who are really interested in research, and that's their main ambition, okay, that is obviously going to be something which is highly attractive, and I would argue would contribute to many people wanting to leave academia.
Yeah, so I must admit I'm quite conflicted about this point. So I think just to put that particular salary that you've spoken about in context, the starting salary for a lecturer in the UK is around kind of 35 to 36k. So you're looking at more than double the average starting salary for a lecturer, essentially doing the same work. So for me, there's an issue here between the absolute pay and the relative pay. I often think about how people in my family who maybe aren't working in academia would think about the amount of money that we are paid. I don't want this to come across as me saying that academics just need to be quiet about pay, because there are issues in terms of that relative level of pay compared to level of qualification. But I think if I was to tell members of my family that at my age, kind of early 30s, I'm earning what I'm earning for doing what I'm doing. I don't have to go out on building sites and in the wind and rain go up ladders and kind of doing any real kind of manual labor, I guess. For me to be paid the amount that I'm paid to sit in a relatively comfortable office with a relatively comfortable job, although we have spoken about the kind of stress and the amount of workload that's involved, I think they would laugh and say, well, you're vastly overpaid for what you're actually doing. And that's not me saying that we are overpaid at all, because I don't think we are, but I don't think the pay is as bad as some people are doing. But that relative pay is particularly important in terms of what we get paid is vastly different, vastly lower than what we would get for the same skills in a non-academic role.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I almost don't know. Again, just like we talked about last week, this is almost deserving of a podcast in itself, with perhaps a guest who's been on both sides of the kind of spectrum. So we welcome anyone to kind of get in touch with us about that. I think that when the pay is fine for the job, I don't think we're disputing that. I think that individuals who are looking to other sectors, industry in quotes, when you do have this build up of pressures, competing interests, flexible but maybe pervasive on your life, working patterns, and you see this opportunity that comes across, which is double the pay for seemingly the same skills but less of the job, you're getting rid of that kind of pastoral care elements. That's where people will be kind of making that shift, that kind of that kind of relative pay is always looked at going forwards rather than looked at kind of, I don't want to say backwards, but sideways in other kind of jobs where the pay is nearly equivalent. And so I think that the pay situation isn't by itself one of the cruxes for moving into industry, because as we've said, being in academia is actually a really flexible job where you do have these key performance indicators, but perhaps you don't always have to meet them in a set and strict way. So we could say that we do have to publish 2 papers, but actually they don't have to be these 2 papers. If one paper is being rejected or taking a year and a half to go through peer review, we've got other papers that we're working on in the side, and so we are able to reach that in a multitude of ways, rather than you've got to do this one particular thing has to work. You do have to bring these average cost of salaries down, for example, in a particular business role. And so there's definitely an accumulation there of some of the reasons why people are leaving, and I think what we've done there is able to put it into context, and each one of those points is deserving of a full in-depth discussion in itself. But what is the key issue for me, and I think this is one of the driving forces for us to produce this podcast, and that's where I'm going to take that pin out that I put in earlier about people being able to express these views on social media, there is a huge elephant in the room in terms of the potential impact that this rhetoric on social media is having on early career researchers and also aspiring academics. So perhaps individuals who are midway through their masters and they're looking to do a PhD with the prospect of going into academia. Now, when I was doing my PhD at the start, and in fact throughout the entirety of my PhD, and please correct me if I was completely oblivious to this, I'm sure I was, but I wasn't made aware of any of this discussion or discourse. However, now I've actually got master's students coming up to me saying, is academia a viable option? Because I'm seeing that people can't get jobs. I'm seeing that people are underpaid. I'm seeing on social media that people are suffering from lots of ill health and poor mental well-being, stuff that we talked about last week, stuff that we really are passionate about contributing to solving. And I'm almost conflicted in a way, and this is kind of where I need your help to help me tease this apart, in that I firmly believe that we need to be talking about these situations and things which are indeed real, but at the same time I'm worried about the impact it's having on the profession as a whole, and whether or not it's putting off excellent researchers, excellent academics from taking that PhD plunge and getting into research or academia.
Yeah. So there's a lot going on, isn't there? So I think you're right in terms of so I think you did your PhD a year or two before I did mine. But I certainly wasn't aware of this kind of discourse either when I was going through my PhD. It does feel like it's a fairly recent thing. I don't think that maybe the concerns aren't recent, I think, but the discussion around them seems to be very recent. And I've had similar situations to what you're describing here, particularly recently, actually. I've spoken to a couple of people so one person in particular who's looking to start their PhD, and one person who's just at the end of their PhD, or towards the end of their PhD. Both of them expressing a concern about whether or not academia is for them, thinking about work-life balance, thinking about pay, thinking about conditions, thinking about whether they would be eligible or viable candidates for academic roles. Both of them very capable, very good young researchers who would be an absolute credit to the profession, but being put off slightly by this kind of narrative around academia and around higher education that is essentially everyone's overworked, everyone's underpaid, no one's acknowledged or appreciated. And what I don't want to do is to say that that's not happening. There will be people who are feeling as though they're underappreciated, they're not paid enough, that they're overworked. And I think we've probably all gone through stages where we feel a little bit like that, in terms of certain pinch points of the year where there's just no time to do the core tasks that you need to, when you've been maybe overlooked for promotions or for roles on different committees, and you think, well, I'm putting all this time in doing extra stuff on the weekends and evenings, and there's no appreciation, there's no reward for that. And I think we all go through those times where we think that maybe the grass is greener on the other side. But I've sat down with both of these individuals and spoken to them from my perspective, and I realize that my perspective might not be representative. It might be that I'm in a particularly privileged position where, as a relatively young male academic with no kind of real responsibilities outside of work, that I can kind of work quite flexibly, and I can kind of have this life where I don't need necessarily to be thinking too much about these issues. I completely get that. But I think some of the concerns around pay conditions are slightly overblown. And what we see, particularly online actually, is if you were to have a couple of tweets, and we've both seen these, even satirical tweets about kind of high workload and productivity in higher education. It's always the high workload, the negative tweet that gets lots of engagement, lots of likes, lots of retweets, lots of kind of kind of positive feedback, whereas the productivity related information doesn't get that much. And we kind of spoke a little bit last week about how we don't see that much of the negative side of academia. I think what people do when they do see particular ideas that are tapping into those more difficult parts of the profession, they kind of latch onto that a little bit, and it gives them an outlet for thinking about some of the more difficult parts of the job. And what that does is, when people see the amount of engagement that that's getting, is it creates this picture of academia as this really toxic environment. And I don't want to say that higher education isn't sometimes a toxic environment, because we know it is, and we know that sometimes there are people that you work with, or areas that you work in, or institutions or departments that you work with, where you clearly wouldn't want to work there, or with those people, or naming no places in particular. But what we see is that becomes the representative image of higher education for a lot of young academics. And for me, that's a problem, because I don't experience academia in that way. I do have negative thoughts about some aspects of the job in terms of workloads that we've already discussed in different episodes, but I don't think that's representative of the job as a whole.
Yeah, I find myself agreeing with you on all of those points. And I think you very eloquently put across the emphasis in terms of why it is important to be focusing contextually on the places that some of these messages are being presented on social media. And you know, we know from psychology, we're both lecturers in psychology, that it is easier to grab onto and sensationalize, you know, some of these more detrimental and negatively biased thoughts and opinions. And I completely appreciate each and every one of those. I think that at all stages we have been through that, we've experienced that, we've talked to other academics who have also experienced that. And for me, it's that we know now that social media is so ingrained in everything we do. It's ingrained in the world that we live in and the world that we practice in. And so because of that, it's almost as if we need to have an extra look over our shoulders, especially if we do have these high platforms, to say, okay, so actually this is the message that I'm putting out there. I know it's getting a lot of traction. Have I done the best job possible at bringing that balance, you know, or was this just a single thought on a single day? You know, it may be spurned by, you know, lots and lots of single thoughts on other single days, but have I done my best at contextualizing this thought here and now, and actually what is the impact that's going to have on someone with great potential to do fantastic things in the profession, who now might be second guessing themselves. You know, they might be looking at all of these reasons for leaving that we talked about in kind of topic 2, looking at a job that is of higher pay and thinking, well, actually, I don't want to put myself through any of this. I'm not seeing any negative connotations about industry, in quotation marks again. And so that, to me, comes across as a much more viable option, which I kind of want to jump into over and above academia, which seems to be in the social media headlines each and every week, you know. So yeah, do you have any additional thoughts on that, or are you happy to leave that there?
I think just to agree with that final point, that there is no hashtag industry Twitter, because industry isn't a thing. Industry is not academia. So when people are seeing all of the negativity on hashtag academic Twitter, they're not seeing the same thing on the other side of the argument. So when we talk about the grass seeming greener, that's not necessarily the case. I think we've touched on some of the issues, and there will obviously be people who have left academia and will see that the grass has been greener, but for others that might not be the case. But we don't hear those stories, and I think if we do have anyone who is listening who wants to come on and have a chat about what the differences are, whether the grass really is greener, that would be a really good conversation to have, because I think the more context we can have about these kind of decisions that people are making, the better.
I think that would be lovely. I think that being able to engage in that conversation, being able to drive discussions in this sector, rather than just relying on single tweets, is going to be a lot more beneficial for everybody. And actually, if we do have that discourse and we can invite people to really debate and contribute to that, then when we are looking ahead to these early career academics looking to get into the profession, they can actually see perspectives from different sides and weigh up their own decisions and conclusions, and ultimately make the best decision which is going to be for them and their career. So thank you very much, Craig, for that really good insight. It's been great talking to you as always. So we're going to bring the podcast episode to a close. Today we've been talking about the argument between academia and industry, or what we want to call not academia because of its vastness and almost vagueness from that. We've talked about the scope of industry and why people are wanting to leave. We've also talked about some of the key issues that academics are facing, which are facilitating them wanting to leave, such as poor mental well-being, lack of being able to express themselves and really impact the general population, and also that element of pay and potential disparities, but also presenting these debates and topics in the wider context of being relative to other jobs, that aren't just this high-flying business sector versus academia. And we've also talked about the potential impact that has on early career academics as well. So thank you very much for the engagement that we've been having across all of our social medias. Make sure to drop us a follow across all platforms. This podcast and other podcasts in this series will be available on the YouTube, but also will be available on everywhere that you like to listen to your podcast. We'll be back in a couple of weeks talking about all of the things that we wish we'd have known when starting our academic journeys. So from Craig and I, thank you very much, and we will see you in the next episode.